Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. I am so thrilled you're here today because we are tackling a seriously fascinating piece of political analysis. Today, we're breaking down a highly charged political commentary delivered by Victor Davis Hanson on the Daily Signal. Now, our goal here isn't to agree or disagree with him, but to thoroughly unpack the actual mechanics of his argument. We're going to put his critique under a microscope and look at exactly how he builds his case against the current state of California politics. It's honestly a masterclass in political rhetoric, and examining it piece by piece is going to help us grasp the absolute core of his message.
Okay. Let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for unpacking this critique. 1. The jungle primary. 2. Taxes and exodus. 3. Mismanaged funds. 4. The Palisades arson. And 5. The luxury trap.
Section 1. The jungle primary. Systemic shifts.
So the source begins his entire argument by pointing to the absolute bedrock of how California runs its elections, the jungle primary. Basically, this is an election where all candidates for an office run in the exact same primary, completely regardless of their political party. Then just the top two advance to the general election. The source neutrally points out that this specific system was designed in a state that already had a heavy Democratic majority to ensure very specific outcomes. He actually blames this very structure for creating overwhelming Democratic supermajorities across the board. And we're talking not just in the state legislature, but in the executive branch and the judiciary as well.
And the primary evidence he brings forward to prove this point is pretty staggering. There hasn't been a single statewide Republican officeholder in California since Arnold Schwarzenegger left office. That's roughly 20 years ago. For the source, this stark statistic isn't just some random historical footnote. He argues it is the direct, fully intended result of the electoral system he just described.
Section 2. Taxes, Costs, and Exodus. The Citizen Impact.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the massive number he brings up next, 4 million. The argument transitions here to the direct financial consequences these political structures have on actual residents. According to the speaker, 4 million is the number of people who have just packed up and fled California over the last 15 years. And he categorizes these fleeing citizens very specifically. He calls them Reaganite or Schwarzenegger-type voters. His argument is that these 4 million people didn't just casually vanish. They were literally economically driven out by the policies of the reigning supermajority.
So what exactly is driving them out? Well, the source stacks up California's tax environment to illustrate what he sees as an overwhelming financial burden. It's kind of like a snowball effect. First, you've got the highest income tax in the nation, at 13.3%. Then, when you factor in county add-ons, you hit the 5th highest sales tax. Add to that the absolute highest gas taxes and the highest electricity costs outside of Hawaii. He even points out a painful irony here. There's a proposed new tax on electric vehicles, specifically because they avoid the high gas taxes the state desperately relies on. He uses this entire list to paint a picture of a taxpayer who is basically cornered at every single turn. This brings us to a highly relatable, real-world comparison. The speaker shares a personal anecdote to highlight the deep disconnect between California and the rest of the country. He recalls national gas prices dropping to around $1.88 or $2 in the past, noting that, people nationally tend to complain when gas hits $4. Meanwhile, his reality in California? He just paid $6.20. The point he's making here is that Californians are paying this extreme premium every single day, which is exactly what fuels the mass exodus we talked about earlier.
Section 3. Mismanagement of public funds. Where does it go?
Because, think about it, for a taxpayer paying that 13.3% income tax and $6.20 for gas, the most logical question is, where does all that money actually go? The source throws out some totally mind-boggling numbers to make his case. First up, $240 billion. He claims California has outright lost this massive sum on the heavily debated high-speed rail project, framing it as a catastrophic failure of public investment. And right on the heels of that, $250 billion. The speaker claims this additional sum was lost to COVID hospice entitlement fraud. So, if you're keeping track, between just these two items, he is accusing the state leadership of mismanaging roughly $500 billion.
So the absolutely crucial point here is how the source believes the state actually justifies these massive losses. He references this specific quote, "Spread the wealth around." According to his analysis, the political left actually tolerates this massive fraud because of a foundational ideology. In his view, they don't see it as stolen taxpayer money at all. They see it as money that simply got distributed to the people. He argues this specific ideological mindset completely prevents any real accountability for government waste.
Section 4. The Palisades arson. Ideology and destruction.
Now, shifting focus from those broad economic arguments to a highly localized anecdote, the source relays a very dark narrative regarding the Palisades arson incident. He outlines that this tragedy resulted in 12 people killed and billions of dollars in property value destroyed. Furthermore, he claims that $100 million raised for charities was allegedly just absorbed by non-governmental organizations with absolutely nothing to show for it. But the real crux of his argument rests on the suspect's alleged motives. He claims the arsonist's search history and social media reveal deep left-wing, anti-billionaire sentiments. The source frames this as an act of destruction motivated purely by an ideological hatred for the wealthy.
And what was the political response to this tragedy, according to the source? Well, instead of rebuilding the beautiful properties that were destroyed, he asserts that politicians, and he specifically names Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass here, use these tragedies as an excuse to push their own ideological goals. He claims their actual subtext is a desire to replace the destroyed wealthy neighborhoods with high-density, affordable housing.
Section 5. The Socialist Luxury Trap, Hypocrisy Accusations. This brings us to the final and definitely most personal phase of his critique. And this brilliantly illustrates what he calls the socialist luxury trap. He points out what he sees as a stark contrast between progressive policy and progressive reality. The policy they push for the public is the high-density housing we just talked about. Buses, high-rises, and shared spaces. But the reality they actually live in? Private mansions and lake houses. He argues that they essentially want European-style density for the everyday citizens, but vast, sprawling estates for themselves.
To prove this, the source provides what we can basically call a real estate roll call to build a case of massive elite hypocrisy. Nancy Pelosi, with 3 mansions, Barack Obama, with 4 homes spanning both coasts, Bernie Sanders, with 3 homes, notably one right on a lake, the late Dianne Feinstein's Lake Tahoe mansion, and John Kerry and Elizabeth Warren's, quote, gracious houses. He jokingly emphasizes that if you're pushing these policies, it seems to be an absolute requirement that you personally own a lake house or a seaside estate. He then narrows his focus from politicians to political commentators, specifically taking aim at Hassan Piker. The source literally labels him the Marxist and the Porsche. He accuses Piker of praising individuals he views as social murderers, while simultaneously indulging in the absolute most extreme forms of capitalism. The speaker verified the value of Piker's vehicle, highlighting that he drives a $200,000 Porsche. The source's argument here boils down to simple math and ideology. He argues that a true Marxist wouldn't buy a luxury sports car. Actually, scratch that. He says they would buy, 4 or 5 Honda Civics and give them to the people to actually help the working class. He uses this $200,000 price tag to argue that for these figures, it's not actually about ideology at all. It's just about gaining power and wealth for themselves. But in stark contrast to Piker's anti-corporate stance, the source actually pauses to defend a massive corporation, United Healthcare. While commentators on the left might constantly criticize massive health insurance companies, the source cites his own positive, real-world experience. He notes he had over $1 million in medical claims with the company and experienced only one tiny minor dispute over a PET scan. He argues they efficiently insure millions of people and strongly pushes back against the narrative that these corporations merely poach on the middle class.
Which brings us to the end of this explainer and the source's ultimate, bewildering paradox. After laying all this out, the sky-high taxes, an exodus of millions of citizens, billions in mismanagement, and stark elite hypocrisy, he leaves us with this huge question. Why do voters continue to elect leaders whose policies they actively oppose? If everyone is so angry about the prices and the state of affairs, why does the ballot box keep returning the exact same results? It's a deeply provocative question that really challenges us to consider how political power, structural systems like the jungle primary, and actual voter behavior really align. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive, and I highly encourage you to keep questioning and exploring the mechanics behind the political arguments we hear every single day. Catch you next time.